Hello, everyone. I'm excited to have Paul Anleitner in the Yours Truly virtual studio to practice some conversation craft with us here today on episode 100. Paul is no stranger to this little corner of the internet, having had several conversations with Paul Vanderklay ranging back to 5 years ago, which is about 15 years in internet time, as well as several conversations with John Vervaeke and Sam Tiedman, another rock star in the corner. As I voraciously started digging around the TLC last year, it was inevitable that I would find Paul Antleitner's work on YouTube. This happened when he entered into conversation with Brendan Graham Dempsey about metamodernism, about late spring last year, around the time that Brendan turned the TLC into an actual podcast circuit. Paul's X bio reads, "I write and speak on the intersection of religion and culture, science and philosophy, with a master's of arts in Christian thought." And he is the host of the podcast Deep Talks. Paul is a deep student of culture, and in recent years has made several correct predictions of cultural trends, including but not limited to the resurrection of the popularity of the band Creed, as well as recognizing the return to sincere cinema with examples like Top Gun Maverick and the upcoming new Superman film by James Gunn as a response to postmodern cynicism. He's also been building upon the conversation related to kayfabe, that visual media isn't what you see as much as it is what you want to see, best exemplified in many ways by the narrative and performative arcs found in the WWF, WWE dramas. Paul is also the author of Disordered, a Christian journey through the problem of evil and suffering, and has written for various media publications, including The Federalist and The Hill. I'm so excited to join Paul in the cultural conversation today here on the Yours Truly podcast. But first, don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe and keep up with the channel. But more importantly, help keep the conversation going by leaving a comment. And if you'd like to help support the channel financially, become a channel member. That link will be in the description. So now clock in, hit the road, do some chores, and join me as we practice some conversation craft here today on the Yours Truly podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Paul Anleitner. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. Paul, thanks for joining me today.
Christian, this is awesome. I love your studio background here too. I have a question. Is that bumper music, is that an original creation?
Oh, no, dude. No,
No?
all stock music. All stock music, yeah. I had a friend on, or he's now a friend I met in this space, Matt Hylam. He runs a stock music company called Morning Like Music, and I'll be using some more of his stuff this year. But that was from one of the kind of generic companies.
Yeah.
I did kind of try to go with the kind of the aughts to tens modern worship kind of sound, because that's like
Explosions in the sky.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I love it. Yeah, a little dotted eighth delay.
Yeah,
Some nice
got it.
pad. Good
You
vibes.
got it,
I like
man.
it.
4 on the floor.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's I had a conversation with Paul Vanderklay last year, and he was like, "You haven't talked to Paul Anleitner. He's a worship leader guy in this space." So, you're already talking the talk.
For sure. I spent a lot of years in that space. Know it very well.
Yeah, man. Exactly. Well, I wanted to start the conversation off today asking really like your relationship and history to this corner of the internet. Like, take that however you want to go, but yeah, what's your relationship, your history with this space?
Yeah. So, I'd say approaching like maybe 7 years ago, as I was originally looking at getting my PhD, just continuing a career in academia. I had just before that time, some really helpful and sobering discussions about the state of academia and, just some practicalities around like job market stuff. Like, hey, if you want to do this as a career, you should be braced for this. This is what's going on. I mean, even my own seminary, graduate school where I'd come out of, even at that time, didn't have a full-time New Testament professor at the St. Paul campus. And it was just, this is the case across the humanities. It's not unique to like theology or philosophy. There's been trouble all over in the humanities. So I started like going, oh, maybe that's not the path. I've always taught in the classroom and have been someone that's worked in churches or parachurch organizations as well. But a really insightful conversation that I had with somebody, an academic, was like, hey, here's the deal. This stuff might crumble. Like, the humanities, especially people going into significant amounts of debt to get a degree in theology or philosophy, that is probably an unsustainable path. But people's questions about the stuff isn't going to go away. It's just going to change into different media and mediums. And so that was like, oh, all right, well, maybe I can think about changing my classroom into a podcast. And so that was really the idea about 7-8 years ago, which was like, I've always either taught full-time or worked at a church part-time on top of it, or it's been flipped over the course of my adult life. And so I was like, I think I'm going to pivot here. And instead of teaching in the classroom anymore, I'm going to try this out. And that was really my goal, was to essentially have like a kind of a classroom where the sorts of stuff, and that's why I even called my podcast Deep Talks. It's probably a horrible name in hindsight, but I called it that because for years I would hear students passing in the hallway who had just left the class, and they were like, hey, what did you do in Mr. A's class today? And be like, man, we just had deep talks, So it was like a term of endearment to me that I retained and held on to. So right around that same time, like, I'm starting that venture. The algorithm feeds up for me this gray bearded man who was talking about like some overlapping similar interests. Clicked on, watched a few of his videos. I'm talking about Paul Vanderklay here. And then very early on reached out to him and was like, hey, you want to be a guest on my podcast? Love a conversation with you. And so that's how I first got connected with Paul Vanderklay. Since that time, we've had a handful of like recorded conversations together. I was even before I knew Paul, I was interested in Jordan Peterson's work, actually, even before the explosion, the culture war explosion stuff around, a pronoun usage and things like that. I had been interested in what was being labeled as this kind of comprehensive discipline of meaning making. And Jordan Peterson was one of those guys that was doing this sort of intersection between cog, sci, behavioral science, tapping into philosophy, theology. So like, I loved those early college lectures, and I had an interest in kind of the stuff he was doing at that intersection of, he's talking about religion, he's talking about culture, he's talking about science. That's what I studied in grad school. And so I had an interest in that, and it was kind of like, through that interest in Peterson's work, and then I think the YouTube algorithm feeding up for me a Vanderklay video or two, getting connected with Paul, and then eventually getting exposed to John Vervaeke through those same channels, that I reached out and got connected with John. I've had him on a couple of times, and we'll be having him on again here at the end of the month.
Cool.
From that, like, getting connected, obviously, with Paul has really done something different, very different than what I've done over the years. I've got a Patreon group and community, but I've got a local church. Paul is very much, I don't know if he feels comfortable with this, but I would say Paul has very much taken the approach of like kind of pastoring a digital community in some sense. I don't know. You'll have to forgive me, Paul, if you're uncomfortable with that sort of title. But in that community, there's been people that, of course, heard Paul's stuff, and then we got connected. Luke Thompson was somebody. Luke lives here in the Twin Cities, and Luke's like just an incredible mind, intellect, conversation partner. And we've gotten together in person a few times, and I wish life were different pace for both of us, where we could do that more frequently. And of course, Sam Tiedemann. And I'm trying to think if there's really been any others outside of that. And I think for a few years, I was on the Bridges of Discord.
Well,
Sometimes it might feel like that. Bridges of Meaning Discord server, and was connected. And I don't know, we maybe even had some interactions on there a few years ago. So I think that would be the most. Oh, I'm forgetting Karen, of course. Karen does great stuff with her Meaning Code channel. We've had a conversation before. She's brilliant and just so wonderful and sweet. Yeah, I don't know if there's been anybody else kind of associated with this little corner that I've connected with, but
So the meaning, you were talking about like the philosophy and the development of meaning making, and that
yeah,
obviously coincides with maybe the cultural crisis of meaning that Vervaeke really named, I guess maybe you helped name around there.
yeah.
Did you see that when you were looking at that? Was that something that you were kind of conscious or were salient to, or was it kind of after the 2016 time that you were like, no, did you think there was a crisis afoot, or did you
Oh,
foresee that?
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, this had been something I'd been talking about in my classes when I was a teacher for years. I didn't use the meaning crisis as the terminology. Instead we were focusing on, I mean, the term I would most frequently use was just nihilism.
Mhm.
The natural conclusion of a materialist story inevitably leads to, if you're trying to have some sort of coherent narrative to live within, and if you adapt, I mean, you can go back. I mean, C.S. Lewis was talking about stuff. It's nothing new in that regard. This is a conversation that we can go all the way back to Nietzsche on, is to see when the death of God happens. Nietzsche wasn't, the parable of the madman isn't Nietzsche like triumphantly going out into the streets going, woohoo, God is dead. That's not it. The parable of the madman is Nietzsche's lament about, yeah, I don't believe in this thing, but I also see the value of what it has done in Western Civ. And when we lose that story, when we lose God, it, it's not going to lead to this like utopia, right? So he was aware of that very early on. And then you get all the existentialists. So I was very, like in my teaching years, very much interested in the existentialists like Camus. And Kierkegaard never called himself, I don't think Camus ever even called himself an existentialist or absurdist. But that sort of wrestling with, we have this narrative since philosophical materialism, reductive physicalism has become one of our normative guiding stories in the West, post-Darwin. And since that time, we have lacked, the narrative has presented itself as a coherent story. Here's a story that explains everything. And if we don't have an explanation for it, we have a process that will inevitably bring us to an explanation. So the hard problem of consciousness, we don't have an explanation for it yet. Give us enough time, and this method will eventually be able to explain that. The only other problem with that, though, is that, when you think about, take the work of Michael Steiger, for example, who was his partner on this paper? I forget his name, it's escaping me. 2016, they read a paper trying to identify what are the kind of like the psychological substructures that support someone's sense of meaning. And they identified three terms: coherence, purpose, and significance. Coherence has to do with, is there a repeatable, discernible pattern to life? And if there is no repeatable, discernible pattern, if it is just completely chaos, random, we cannot discern a pattern, there you feel a sense of meaninglessness because there is no trajectory to this story. You can't make sense of anything. But the other structures are purpose and significance. So the materialist story said, hey, we've got a coherent story here. Look at this. It explains everything. Our scientism explains everything. We have understand the mysteries of the universe. And then you get to like the follow-up questions of, okay, so we have this repeatable, discernible pattern. The question of purpose then is, does that pattern point to a telos to life? So we get to we can talk about this in like Aristotelian terms. So they were talking about the material causes. Hey, we've explained all the material causes. But what about the final cause? The final cause has to do with, this cup I have in front of me here, this large glass of mason jar that I use for water here. I could describe the material cause of, the whatever goes in the glass, I'm not a scientist, whatever makes glass, whatever made this, the material stuff that made up this glass. But that doesn't tell me about its final cause. The final cause of this glass has to do with the glass maker's intentions for it and its ability to hold and contain things. And right now, it's fulfilling its purpose. It's fulfilling its final cause. The
You could
scientific
even
story.
say it's transcended its cause from jelly to water. It's
Yeah.
transcended.
For sure. For sure. And it may have multiple causes for it, you know. But the materialist story said, hey, we've got the material causation all figured out. But then you're like, well, what about final cause, which has to do with the question of purpose? Is life headed in any sort of direction? And you listen to, like, you know, the new atheists, like a Dawkins, and he's like, no, there is no purpose. There is no purpose to this. And you're like, well, that's a problem, because I have an inherent drive for purpose that I can't just like shut off. That's baked in to me. And then there's still that final question of, not only does life have an overarching goal or telos, is there a final cause to it, but what role, if any, do I play in that story? That's the question of significance. Because you could go and be like, hey, I see a coherent pattern. Christians, I mean, I think Christians wrestle with this still. They can be like, yeah, like I'm in this like Christian story. I can see that there's like an overarching purpose to the story it's leading, and they can still wrestle with questions of significance, where it's like, yeah, but I don't feel like I play any meaningful role in that story. And so in the absence of a story that can lead to satisfactory answers about coherence, purpose, and significance, we are inevitably left in a vacuum of nihilism. We stand at the edge of the abyss. And the meaning crisis, I think, is another way of naming what the West has been wrestling with for quite some time. Obviously, Vervaeke takes this back much further in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lectures. But at the very least, we can take this back to Nietzsche in the West. And I think in more recent times, the phenomenon has maybe exponentially increased as those ideas have been disseminated throughout pop culture. And more recently, Christian, I've been really fascinated with the ways in which that narrative of despair, the anti-story, if you will, has moved from high culture, has moved from the ivory towers of academia, and has disseminated through popular culture in a way that has shaped us in a direction that I don't think we are fully aware of until we sit down and realize, yeah, I consumed that story, that movie, that thing, and I believed in some part in that narrative, and it produced this thing in me. So I've been really fascinated with how that's happened over the last, really since the 90s from my vantage point. And then more recently, how we are becoming more aware that the cynicism, David Foster Wallace talked about this back in the 90s. He's in the high culture, arts, literature, and he's going, at once, the postmodern story, the anti-story, he didn't call it that, but the postmodern story, it felt liberating. But he said, inevitably, it's patricidal. Postmodernism is inevitably patricidal. It's about the killing of your father. You know, it's like the hero's journey where you have to confront the father, and in postmodernism, you kill it, and you feel like you've been liberated from the past. And so David Foster Wallace is lamenting as early as 1997. He goes, the cynicism that once felt liberating now feels enslaving. And when Burger King is telling you to break the rules to sell you a burger, you better wake up, right? And I think it's taken us some time. What I'm sensing is there's like a waking up from the spell of cynicism, from incessant irony. And you mentioned from the get-go, I think that's why people are listening to Creed. Like post-ironically listening to Creed. I think that's why they come out of a Top Gun Maverick and they go, man, that was just kind of refreshing. Like, did it critique or subvert any story? No. Not really, but it gave me something aspirational to look to. And it felt like free of that cynicism that we've been swimming in forever.
And it's interesting because, you know, I mean, there's so many jumping off points from that. I'll try to see which way I want to go with this, but I'll just play on the vantage point of like the postmodern and the evolutionary narrative did undermine a lot of what I would say is like evangelical, like the deconstruction movement of evangelical en masse. Like, because when I was using that framework that you were doing, it said something like you had coherence, purpose, and significance. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And so I remember going to like Passion with Louis Giglio back in the mid aughts, and like he had a sermon called Passion and the Pursuit of Blue Jeans. And it was all about this idea that everybody is significant in their story and in their passion. You know, like if you like making jeans and that's your passion, then you should go after it. And I could see like that, you know, Passion was the name of the movement, right? So it's like go after your passion. But once the coherence of the Christian narrative dissolved underneath many of those people related to things around scientism, new atheism, postmodernism, which was right after that with like woke or whatever you want to call that. Like I see that dissolved for people, and then they have that crisis because they may have had significance, but then they may have felt like they had purpose, but then it's like, but it's not. They quit believing that it was on something coherent. So I found that really, really interesting when I think about, you know, it's kind of like you need all three parts of the stool to hold your meaning.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, so when I'm watching all that deconstruction stuff, that's kind of, and having been so of that culture, you know, going to Passion and playing doing that whole scene, you know, watching all that fade away. So it's really interesting. And then the part about the aspiration, like with Creed, it's funny because so I was 15 when I started playing guitar, and one of the first like licks that I learned was the intro to Higher by Creed.
Oh yeah,
you know?
I can still play it right now.
Yeah, exactly. And then, you know, but I have like a really high voice, and that didn't really go with like. And then the emo music scene came out. It's like all these guys like screaming up here. It's like, oh, this are my people. And then it was like, I have to like shun this, you know, make fun of this sound, this Scott Stapp inspired, you know, The Doors and whatever else was like coming through with all that. Third Day, this like guttural, this kind of like thing, and it was like just part of, you know, the cynicism, what comedy was doing in the culture, taking these things and then like turning them into stereotypes and tropes and all that stuff. Just you know, and Scott went through some hell. Like who knows all the pieces that were playing like into that, you know, being a meme, like we made a meme that way. But it is interesting to see now, because part of me was wondering a few years ago, post-COVID, you know, all the live shows, people were just dying to get together, all these, and it was a weird time for like the millennial Xers that were like coming into, like, their kids were growing up and they're like, I just want to go to some shows again. Like, and so all the emo bands are like selling out arenas, and Creed's selling places out because it's like people are dying to get together, the nostalgia factor, and people at some point did tip over this, like, I don't care if people don't think this is cool or something like, and just watching that play out, it's like, this is a part of my history and a part of my life that I cherish, and, you know, I want to celebrate and not feel, so I was seeing that play out. Yeah, go ahead.
Here's the weird thing though about the Creed thing, because I think you're right. People have said, well, is it nostalgia in the same way that, you know, I remember, what festival, big Christian festival, did they bring back like immediately post-COVID? Maybe it was Furnace Fest or Cornerstone or something for one time, and they brought back the emo and the hardcore bands, and, you know, it's largely guys. I don't know how old you are, Christian. I'm 40. How old am I? 41. You know, so it's largely guys in their 30s, 40s.
Be 40, yeah, be 40 in 2 months.
Ah, congrats. Welcome to the other side. Largely guys that, are like, yeah, I miss that sense of community. I miss a mosh pit. Honestly, I've told my kids this. I've told my 16-year-old son this because he's never been at a pit before. He's never seen that. I showed him recently Woodstock 99 footage of Korn, and they're opening with Blind, are you ready? And you have when the drums kick in after the when that finally kicks in and he goes, are you ready? You see like
Yep.
300,000 people, and he's watching that with me going like, Dad, that looks awesome. I would
Mm,
love to be there. So there's that kind of thing that they have never experienced that we have been really far removed from. And I understand that. And nostalgia is people I'm actually end of the month here. I'll be having Vervaeke on with Dr. Clay Rutledge together. And Clay Rutledge has done a lot of work around nostalgia as a stabilizing force when you're experiencing a crisis of meaning. And so it's really fascinating. I think that there's something there. The thing I would just want to say about the Creed thing, because people said, well, maybe is it just nostalgia? I would say it actually isn't just nostalgia. The Creed thing was different because the first place I noticed it were younger Gen Z people on like TikTok and Instagram who have no experience of like living through, like, I remember the first time I heard My Own Prison on the radio. I can like distinctly remember I was in the back seat of my friend's minivan, and we're all Christian youth group kids. And
yep.
like, we're listening to 89X, which was the alternative rock station in Detroit at the time. And this song comes in and we're like, is this Pearl Jam? Because, he's got that Vedder-esque voice. And then we're listening to the lyrics. I'm like, this sounds like a song we could sing in youth group. That was like our framework. So I
Yep.
remember that experience. I remember us finding the nearest possible record store and
Mm,
going and buying My Own Prison. And I
wow.
remember that. So yeah, I have feelings of nostalgia around that. I also totally get being a musician and going through the phase of like, well, after My Own Prison, it was like, yeah, the emo thing kicked in. The deeper you got into musician circles, the more snobby hipster music you had to at least feign some sort of affection for, even if you didn't actually like it. And that was kind of a way of signaling that you wanted to be part of the in group. It was like, yeah, I don't like Creed. It's of course it's In Rainbows from Radiohead, or you know, some band that's
Yep.
Fugazi, or something.
Hmm.
So you
Hmm.
had to kind of do that. And so I remember that. I have some nostalgia for that. But what I started noticing was like it was primarily with younger Gen Z who would never have they never listened to Creed in the first point. And might go, well, yeah, there might be Gen Z kids that are into vinyl and they never had vinyl before. This was something different. I think it was that for a long time they had lived with the Creed memes like you're talking about. I would say their native tongue was the hyper ironic Creed memes,
Yeah.
the, you know, all the stuff that was out there. And so that was their first exposure to it, which then led them to being like, well, what is Creed? And so the thing I would suggest with this is that for those young people who have lived constantly hyper aware at all times of what they would call the cringe, right? You don't want to be cringe. And cringe can be the possibility that you would say something sincere and someone would interpret it as naive, and then you get lambasted all over all the social media feeds for your sincerity that is actually naivete. And I can't imagine how exhausting that would be all the time. I've
Yep.
talked with my own like teenage kids about it. You know, I can't understand. I literally can't understand like what that psychological burden would be like in middle school and high school. I didn't live through that. So the idea that you could get to a point where you're just like, I've called it embracing the cringe, which might be a cringe statement even to begin with, but I don't care. There's a point that you can get to where you're like, I know I'm in a story. So the postmoderns are like, yeah, it's all narratives, all just mask a play for power. So your guiding stories are just, they're all relative. and you should be suspicious of them at all times, because guiding stories are all tools by people in power to keep and maintain their power. And you're like, oh yeah, so I got to be suspicious of everything, and I got to be cynical of everything. And eventually you go, I just want to feel something good. I just want to feel something wholesome. I just want to feel something sincere. That's the image of God within us, aching for that, because that's what we're made for. We're made for the good. And there's a place for critique, and there's a place for reform. So what I saw these videos of, it started as still kind of like quasi-ironic enjoyment. And then I started noticing one of the things that was like right away, there was like this gal who seemingly was like a young country artist. She was in her green room with her band, and they were just ripping together this like acoustic version of, I forget what Creed song. And she was so sincere about it. So sincere. And I was like, they've gotten beyond the irony. This is post-ironic. They're aware that Creed is butt rock. They're aware that Creed is not cool. They're aware that Creed is cringe, and they're embracing the cringe, and they're moving beyond it and going, I don't care. I know it's cringe. But I just don't care anymore. I just want to be free of this cynicism and feel something sincere. So that would be for me like a differentiating point between maybe what guys like you and me feel if, like, if Blindside came to town, and I was like, Blindside was one of my favorites. I'd be like, yeah, I'll go experience that for nostalgia's sake. I think there was something different with the Creed thing, which is evidenced in the fact that this is insane. They had their 2024, they had their highest grossing year of all time.
Oh.
They played Woodstock 99. They did that.
They were,
infamous
they were as big. Yeah, they were as big as it got at a point. Yeah.
As big as it got. And last year, they grossed more in ticket sales, streaming revenue than they ever had before. I don't think that's just kind of like older guys like you and me that are going, it's kind of like the previous generation still maybe hung on to like Twisted Sister and Guns N' Roses. This was something different. Different.
Well, the interesting thing about the, like, even you referencing like, hey, did you make that song to the intro of this? Like, that's in, like, I don't think I realized that I was kind of trying to embody my own version of this new sincerity, or because like, I kind of know, like, as I'm approaching 40 and, even what I wear or whatever, like, or even this, like, hey, I'm a fan of these guys.
Great.
Like,
yeah,
people could see that as cringe because it's like, dude, whatever. And
totally.
And I was like, but this is kind of like who I am. I'm just gonna own it. But I could feel the irony and the cynicism of myself, even in some of that. And what I've seen, I think that's what's interesting a little bit about the scene around Paul Vanderklay, and what I've even seen a little bit in this last year. I've done like 70, 80 conversations, and it's like the ones that are kind of in the vein of the Paul's rando thing is when you come up and you be yourself on the internet. Technically everybody could see it. Everybody's not going to see it, but like mentally what that does, I think, is I'm okay as myself. There's like a power to that that's real. And then it's like, I'm going to talk on Twitter like I have a voice because, it was maybe just one podcast on a guy with 600 subs on YouTube. It's like not that big, but it is significant in a type of being known and a type of being free from, like you said, the idea of the viral, being known for a viral sincerity that gets mistaken as naivete. And I think that is so real. I love all of that. I was going to ask you, this is a little bit kind of like shifting the conversation, but what do you think drives your curiosity? Where does that come from for you? For like this journey into culture, like what has it, can you identify where that comes from in your life?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Christian. I don't know if anybody's ever asked me that, like in a podcast before. Um, I have. So did you see Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not. I'm not in. I just want to preface. I'm going to do like the self-deprecating Minnesotan thing here. I am not going to compare myself to Robert J. Oppenheimer in any way, shape, or form, other than to say there was one scene that made my eyes tear up a little bit. And it was very early on in the film where that beautiful music is coming in. That's actually like it's speeding up its time signature. I forget the name of the song and I forget the name of the composer. It's the same guy that did the Mandalorian theme. He killed that soundtrack. That soundtrack is beautiful. There's this scene early on where he's still he's still young and he is kind of like thinking through, he's imagining the implications of the science that he's interested in. And as he is kind of just imagining this, you see these like sparks flying, right? It's like cutting away, the music is going, and you kind of get this sense that this guy is like in his own world, you know? And that made me tear up a little bit because I feel that not in the same fields, but I have felt since, in some ways since my youth, but I've felt just that thing in me that oftentimes is like people don't understand the, I just have this, it's not a desire to figure out the world so that I can control it. It's just genuine wonder and curiosity. And I just find myself like attracted to wonder, and I'm attracted to why it's manifested in these specific areas. It hasn't always been in here, early on, especially growing up in a charismatic church. The wonder was expressed in the creation of music. That for
Hmm.
us was like the highest sacrament was
Hmm.
was music. And
Right.
so it started there in my youth, but then that kind of like fed into this desire to be like, it opened up my heart for wonder towards God and that which was beyond what I knew. And that got me into theology and understanding church history. And, someone very early on, a mentor of mine was like, here, you need to read this book from Kierkegaard. I'm like 18, 17 years old. I got no business reading Kierkegaard at 18 or 17. And I think it's just for me, I feel a sense of wonder, and I just want to follow that. And so, I think in my own journey of meaning making, it has taken the expression in recent years of like, uh, it is an enterprise to find a holistic, coherent story to live in. And then on the flip side, um, I've been in ministry because in my day job, because I have a heart for people to be free from despair,
Mm.
to not be in patterns of brokenness, and to be under the sway of sin with a capital S, that power which creates cycles of death and harm. And so I'm trying to minimize that in other people's lives and to invite them on a journey of wonder. And so that's what drives me. And I'm not driven. This is why people, and I've had people over the years go, Paul, you should really like talk more about like culture war stuff and like help us, in their own words, like help us win the culture war. And it's like, my wonder is not interested in winning. I, and I think sometimes even I can understand, sometimes I'll have tweets that might go viral, and even talking about like just recently some of the stuff that's been gone on with Joe Rogan, where I'm like, I can totally see Joe on a journey of wonder that I think is leading him more and more towards Christ. Now, people might look at that and go, "Ah, that's fuel for winning for our team, and we want the evangelical team to win, or we want the Catholic team to win." Not Kierkegaard, Vervaeke, is borrowing Plato's terminology. He calls that, the Philia Nikeia drive,
Hmm.
the love of victory instead of the love of wisdom. I just have found in my own life that winning, and I'm very, very competitive. I played basketball in college. Like, I'm a competitive guy, but I also realized the emptiness of winning. Um, I winning at what cost? I'm not interested in winning something. I'm honestly interested in the truth insofar as I can perceive it. And when I realize I've perceived in part, I want to be open to the fact that there's more that transcends me that I still want to perceive.
So that's the the journey into wonder. And that's, I mean, you hear in the space like Jonathan Peugeot's like the re-enchanted world.
Yeah.
Were you into what kind of you said, I remember I recently watched your video about like kayfabe with wrestling, but like, were you into anything that was kind of enchanted, like fantasy or sci-fi? Was that a part of
Yeah,
your makeup?
totally.
Like, what were some of
Totally.
the makeup of that?
I
And
mean, I think there's the Venn diagram for people that are interested in this sort of stuff and are interested in fantasy, sci-fi, those sorts of things have a lot of overlap. I think people high in openness generally trait openness as part of the big five. I think people that are generally high in openness have a fascination with open worlds of possibility and science
building
fiction,
worlds.
world building, all that sort of stuff. I'm way interested in those things. From a very early age, my dad exposed me to Star Trek, the original series, and my mom would tell me about, even at 3 or 4 years old, she'd be pushing me in the cart at the grocery store, and I would be pretending to be Captain Kirk and calling her Spock, as people would look around going, "What's wrong with this kid?"
Sure, she
Spock, why
appreciated
aren't
that.
you responding to me? She would tell me that, as concerned parents would wonder what's wrong with this boy. So, whether it's Star Trek, and I remember the first time being at my neighbor's house, and I had not seen, I don't know how old I was, but my neighbor had Return of the Jedi on. I just so happened to walk in the third act as Luke is, kind of being hunted underneath that weird stairwell thing by Vader, and he's hiding in the shadows, and Vader is tempting him and alluring him to turn toward the dark. And that was my first exposure to it, and seeing his face as he wrestled with the light and dark, and should I turn towards anger? I was hooked. I was like, "Oh, Mom and Dad, we need to go back and watch all of these." So that stuff, for sure, absolutely. And then comic books. I've got, you can't see it in view. I mean, I got comics all over the place. To me, this is American mythology. These are our Greek myths. So yeah, totally interested in that stuff for sure.
So that, all those things, it seemed like, and you probably grew up in this culture similar to me in a way. I was more in like the Baptist. I did have some charismatic when we were younger, and then moved into the Baptist church. And but that there was the quote unquote separation between the sacred and the secular, or the myth and Bible history and all that stuff. Like, how do you all see that? Where we're at now, these things like with the symbolic nature and metaphorical symbolic things, really, there was, I mean, I would call it cringe now, honestly, but like the mega church movement of using, the Avengers or whoever is like the theme for church on Sunday. No offense if that's what you do on Sunday, but like, but like, that's one element of it. But like, there's like this maybe a higher element of, Peugeot with fairy tales and comics, even with like the history. Like, these things seem to be, when I think about the enchanted world, I think that the world, the way I frame that right now is that this divide between sacred and secular is like basically almost vanished. And it's like, well, the whole world is this, and the truth is in the whole world. There's not some like hard line in between. It's like, well, that's there, and there's elements of it or something. Where are you seeing where we're at on that journey now?
It's weird, Christian, because you talk about cultures, and you have your dominant macro cultures, which would be like, we could say, the West or American culture, but we're not just situated in a dominant macro culture. We all have our own unique subcultures that we live in. And so like, we could say our regional, like, I lived in the Midwest my entire life. That's a subculture of American culture. I lived in evangelical culture my entire life. And then a subsidiary of that was, for most of my life, I was in charismatic and Pentecostal subcultures. Then I have my local family microculture, all of that stuff. And each of those have guiding stories to them. And the interesting thing was, unlike the context you inhabited, which there was overlap. So I have the overlap of, I live in the West in the age of modernity, in which the secular and the sacred have separate divisions and separate boxes, the immanent and the transcendent. I lived in the secular age, but I also had this really weird subculture experience where it was like, I lived in charismatic and Pentecostal culture. I've seen things that people would not believe. From a very young age, I have had, this is going to sound like hubris. I literally don't have a better word to describe it. I've had, since I was a child, prophetic dreams that have foretold future events in vivid detail. I could tell you many such stories of that. And maybe if you want me to circle back around to that, I can. I don't. But the point being is that I also existed in this culture, which it still weirdly had the supernatural and the natural in separate boxes. But we were like running after the supernatural all the time, all the time. And so in that way, church for me was an enchanted experience.
Yeah.
It was wild, strange. Some of it came with a lot of the things that people who have deep concerns about the pre-modern world are rightly concerned about. Superstitions, aversion to science, to reasoning. And so for me, in my own experience, I was like, the idea that that Luke Skywalker could have some premonition of the future, or Jedi could do that, was like, yeah, duh. Like, I've had dreams like that all the time. I've had, in our church context, people would get prophetic words. You know, I'm sure many of your listeners are probably like, dude, this is weird territory. I completely understand and respect that. I find it weird too. But
Yeah.
the weirdness, I've seen things that I would probably still describe. I could also assign the scientific language to it, and I don't see them being at odds, but I have seen demon possession, or at least everything that would look like what we read about demon possession in the Gospels. So I haven't had this same thing that a lot of people who have even grown up in Christian contexts, like, that just have never got exposed to that side of the Christian tradition, might wrestle with more. If you were in a cessationist Baptist church, if you were in, who's the guy out in California that's like the strange fire conferences and decries charismatic, John MacArthur.
MacArthur, yeah.
Yeah, if you grew up in a MacArthur context, yeah, that stuff is going to feel even more foreign and strange to you. So I didn't have as hard of time with that. For me, my work has been, I want to integrate the two together. And so you'll probably, if you've been a long time listener to my podcast, you can kind of see that's one of the things I've been long working out. How do I have an integrated, holistic worldview, not just merely enchanted or disenchanted, but something that we don't abandon immanence in the pursuit of the transcendent, and yet we can endow the immanent and the mundane with all of the sacredness that it deserves. We can be all right with things like miraculous healings, the raising of the dead, dreams, visions, angels, stuff that's weird, and still not revert to some sort of strange paganism, to dissolve the goodness of God in his gift of general revelation, where it's like, yeah, math and science, I can follow God's light of general revelation, and then I can come to these conclusions, so if I have an ear infection, I can take antibiotics. I don't just have to get the Pentecostal, anointing oil, and have the minister put the anointing oil on my head. That works awesome, but all of it is a gift from God. And so I'm trying to integrate these together. I don't have a problem with either category. It's trying to figure out, how do we have a more holistic vision that encompasses both.
Do you feel like the conversation between, even so if you having like a charismatic context and history, for words like angels, demons, and possession, all that kind of stuff, and then seeing it in what we would call like a real experience, or people like the word literal, but that usually is actually pointing at like literature, but like having an actual experience with what you perceive to be that, being able to have the conversation with the academy. I think that is part of, and I want to ask you about your engagement with metamodernism, because that's kind of, it seems a little bit like what we're touching on to a degree. Like we've talked about what's after postmodernism, but even in like some, in my very elementary understandings of philosophy, but like something like Hegelian dialectic, or synthesis and antithesis, or thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, like where having conversations with people that would maybe not acknowledge or believe that those things were real, but that the words are real and they represent something real, and are no longer, instead of just hearing the word angel or hearing the word demon or possession, being like, I may not think it's this, but I'm okay actually communicating with you in those terms, or something like that. I feel like that is part of something beyond where we're at, where it's like, I can't use that word. I can't communicate with you on that level. Do you have thoughts on that?
Definitely. I think one of the benefits of postmodernism, and again, I've been maybe lately talking about the detriments and the ways that it is led to cynicism, but that is set with an asterisk, where I go, well, the problem with postmodernism is that you have to have implicitly, if you're going to critique a story and say, well, this is colonial oppression, et cetera, or we need to include women, we need to include these kinds of people in the story, you implicitly have a higher referential point that you're aiming towards. You just might not be aware of it. So you have a higher story. If you have a Homelander critique of Superman, it's because you have the Superman ideal in mind. Otherwise, it's empty. So one of the benefits of a postmodern critique in this regard is that it has maybe made us aware in the West, in particular, of some of the blind spots, or some of the things that we just assumed were true, but were mainly part of they were culturally agreed upon. So when postmodern philosophers came around, and they were starting to say things like, and this is broad brushstrokes, the real philosophers of postmodernism out there are going to be like, oh, you're making a characterization here. But when they were critiquing the modern project, they were critiquing, in some regards, why are we asking these questions in this particular order to get to the bottom of what's behind everything? So why do we start with this question? Why do we start with metaphysics? Why do we start with ontology? Why are we starting with the nature of things, as if we had some sort of third person objective perspective on the nature of things? And so maybe even the order of questions is in question, or maybe we even need to start to think about, like, what do words mean at all? And so, looking at your posters in the background, I say this as an attempt to give what I perceive to be an accurate presentation of their work, and not in any way. I don't want somebody to hear this as a critique, but I'm much more familiar with Peterson than I am with Peugeot. I am familiar with Peugeot. I haven't had as long of history, like studying and following his stuff. But they are doing a project that is very much influenced by postmodernism. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Please hear me. So every time Peterson is asked the question of, do you believe in God? And, the meme is, well, what do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by God? He's doing a postmodern questioning of the question itself. And again, that's for those of you that really have strong feelings about postmodernism, and you're interpreting that as me dissing Peterson. It is absolutely not. It's not a diss. It's to say, you don't have that same sort of thing in modernism. So your question about, like, what's happening in maybe a meta-modern shift is, we go through, I don't think we're not deleting postmodernism. We have to go through it because this is the culture we've been swimming in. We can't just like Men in Black mind wipe it from our memories. So we have to go through it in some sense. So when I do hear, and I have heard Peugeot talk about things like principalities and powers, angels, and also hyper objects. I find the language of hyper objects to be really, really helpful in translating an idea, a phenomenology, a phenomena that may be imposing the ancient language on, of whether we want to call it malach in Hebrew for angels, whether we want to call it
Mammon.
I'm losing my daemon, that
Or
to
mammon.
impose. Say again.
Mammon.
No, daemon,
Okay.
for demon, the Greek word, which before it was assigned in, our New Testament context in Second Temple Judaism as being this would be a longer rabbit trail, but the disembodied spirits of deceased Nephilim who are inherently malevolent. It didn't have a malevolent connotation. So if I want to force and be like, this is the word, and this is the word that you have to use to understand this phenomena, but I am blind to the fact that the word employed in their original context brings up a range of meanings that I miss as a modern person. The postmodern critique has been helpful in me seeing my blind spots and going, well, when I think about angels and I have consumed all of this Western literature and imagery of them, looking like whether they're chubby babies, whatever, that word no longer is attached to the meaning of an author's intention in an ancient context. And so the postmodern critique has been helpful to be like, you don't have it all, right? It has been not helpful insofar as it goes, we could never get to meaning at all. And so my pivot,
it would collapse collapsing underneath relativism.
Right. So the symbol is Christ an archetype? Yes. In a Jungian sense, yes. The archetype cannot be an endless, it cannot be an endless symbolic pointing to another symbol, which points to another symbol, which points to another symbol, without getting to like the symbol of all symbols, a prime symbol, a thing that we could say is real in whatever that word means in all of its complexity. Is Christ an archetype, as Peterson says? Yes, he is. He's true myth, as C.S. Lewis would argue. Is that enfleshed in incarnate, tangible flesh and bone, whatever the word history means? I would say yes. Divorced of that, divorced of it ever coming to a point of like, God is not merely the abstraction of my highest ideals. Yes, what I call God in the language of Tillich is that which is of ultimate concern. That's existentially true. I'm sorry if I'm losing anybody here. It is existentially true to say, whatever I give my most attention to, like Peterson suggests, functions as God in my life. But my goal then is to try to get at a project that the moderns and the pre-moderns had, right? Which is to say, there is something behind the word. There's something behind the symbol. There's something behind the archetype. If we keep going, we're not merely talking about having your values. God is not merely the abstraction of the best cultural values we've decided on here in the West. That's not it. I would say the quest is to figure out why the West has collected these particular values and they have been successful in producing certain results that have led to human flourishing and have led to some semblance of salvation. But behind it all, we are still saying that which is ultimate concern should lead me to a journey of going, this is where the optimism of metamodernism, the aspiration of metamodernism comes in. Because the postmodern story says it's like C.S. Lewis argued, postmodernism was always trying to see through something. If you're always trying to see through something, that is a form of blindness. We have to actually get to seeing something. And so I recognize I am in a story, but instead of being cynical and in despair that I'm in a story, I recognize I have to have a story. I have to pick a story. I have to make claims. I have to live in a certain direction. And so my quest is to go and be like, yes, I'm not naive. I'm not naive that I am a Christian because my parents were Christian. Like, I'm not denying those cultural inputs, but I am also saying I cannot be endlessly suspicious. And so the symbol is an invitation to get to go beyond the symbol, and that I have to affirm that there is a foundational bedrock there. It isn't merely just endless symbols. And this is a difference I don't think Peterson will ever get to, insofar as he is a disciple of Jung, and Jung is a disciple of Kant, which is to say that the limitations of reason keep us from being able to access the truths of the noumenal or the spiritual. And so you have to always approach it with humility, which is true. Jung's route was to say, Jung could never answer the question of, well, is Jesus physically resurrect from the dead? Like, if we were walking in those days and, in the 40 days after his resurrection, would we have been able to touch and to feel in the same way? He would just say, you can't answer that. And so Peterson is a disciple of Jung. But there's another side of that family tree, which is Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard also goes, there's limitations to reason, but the way that we actually access the truth, because the truth is ultimately paradoxical, is we access it in faith. So I think part of what metamodernism is opening us up to is the necessity of faith. The necessity of faith in saying, I have to choose a story. I have to choose a story to live in. Will I ever have all of the information that reason could provide? Will it always just be a quest of pure reason? No, it can't. Is the opposite of that I'm left with endless cynicism, endless suspicion? No. What I would say from my vantage point, I would invite others into, is to be like Peter and go, it's 3:00 in the morning. I'm in a boat. I look out on the waves. I see an apparition of what looks like Christ, but it also looks like a ghost. We hear his voice, and the way I figure it out is go not by logical deduction, not by constantly being suspicious and staying in the boat my entire life, but by stepping out. That's Kierkegaard's argument.
You have the leap of faith, and
It's the aspirational goal of going, it might be him. That's what Peter is saying. It might be him. How do I find out?
That's the interesting thing, because my critique of I had a couple of conversations with Brendan, and my critique of that is that to the same point, like understanding in the pluralistic postmodern way, like, yeah, the chances of me being a Christian in India are a lot lower than in Arkansas. That whole thing, that's real. But I have to, but does that leave me in just an endless sea of being unattached to my own history, unattached to a faith that I believe in something? No, I have to then make a leap or a choice. And I think that there's something. And so what is that? I would say something like what it seems like in a more pluralistic perspective, trying to get beyond, is like, we have to, there has to be another, network, another existence that's more pure than the medieval one, or the ancient one, or and I'm like, well, yeah, and no, because those networks already, there is a place to practice the leap of faith, and to embody it, instead of just hoping for the next, like, that you can't, if you live your whole life like just ambiguously pluralistic.
Yeah.
I don't know. And so the thing that it was making me think about was you mentioned earlier the sacrament of music and charismatic and kind of modern church worship and stuff, but even within like the Pentecostal charismatic, the manifestation or the belief in the manifestation of a real connection to God. And I would move that and shift that then into something like the Eucharist, or like those, like the belief in a real connection,
Means of
tangible.
grace.
Yeah, and that's, but having to make that choice to believe, you're making that choice every week. That
Oh,
and it's past a rational, rationalistic frame that you may appreciate in other areas of life, but you have to come here and just like live in that question and that mystery of like, and make that choice. Like, yeah, I, and that critique you had on Peterson or Jung, I guess, would more so. I did actually hear Peterson tell Alex O'Connor, I think if you put a camera in front of the grave, you would have seen somebody come out of the grave. So he's like,
yeah.
a little closer than maybe Jung on that, or that's what he said in the podcast. But
Yeah, but the camera thing is always interesting too, Christian, because this is, I think, this was like even still the failure of modernist hermeneutic, is to
sure,
say a camera, like if I took my phone, if we're saying like I took my phone, right, it was Back to the Future to the resurrection that Sunday morning, I had my phone out and I captured it and then I shared it with you, you would still be interpreting a text.
yep,
This is still a text. You still
yeah,
have to interpret it. This is not objective. The video is not objective. You are still left with the act of interpretation. So interpretation is inevitable. What I'm actually suggesting here, and I don't know if people can get this or not, you have already made a leap of faith into something.
oh
You have
yeah,
already accepted a story. You have already, whether you're aware of it or not. So when, I think I've heard in discussions between John and Paul Vanderklay, discussions about this idea of like making a hallway, the Silk Road hallway, that we're making this hallway and then you have these different doors and these different, we already have with the hallway an unaware acceptance of some figure. Well, let's call it Christ. Let's call it a functional Christ who governs as Lord over that hallway, establishing its rules and norms. The hallway itself, this is what Brendan actually does a good job of doing. Brendan and I have differences of opinion on hermeneutics of scripture, how to read the Bible. We have differences of opinion on a number of things. But I think the meta twist is to go, hey, we're in a hallway. You've got Taoism over here. You've got the Eastern Orthodox bros over here. You got the trad caths here. And what I'm trying to do is make a hallway where they can all come together and have dialogue and dialogos. You have a functional Christ who's Lord over that hallway, who's assigning to you the values, the norms, and the practices of how you're going to abide in the hallway. I know that might feel meta, but that's
it
the
is
thing.
liminal,
It is.
liminal and meta.
Yeah, there's already something there. And I think Tom Holland's point has been that we have been unaware of how much the Christian story and Christ has formed our imaginations in such a way where we assume that a positive charitable dialogue in the hallway is a good thing. Why is that? If we were in a hypothetical Klingon culture, let's tap into sci-fi here. The Klingons in Star Trek have an entirely different, they're like the abstraction of the Spartan culture to the highest degree. You don't settle things through charitable debate. You're not looking for dialogos. You're going to have a battle to the death with your Klingon brother, and that would be a good. That's because they had, to get super nerdy here, the Klingons had a different guiding story about how creation came to be. And it's through struggle, it's through war. We cannot just assume that the laws that govern the hallway and the Silk Road are inherently universal. We are accepting in faith some story. And it might be some amalgamation of a range of values that we would say, oh, these are Christian and they're also this and this. And but I'm just saying, you've already accepted a story. And I think it's awareness of the story and going, yeah, I'm aware I'm in the story. Every time I go to church, Christian, I'm embracing the cringe. Like I am. I'm embracing the cringe. I don't think what I'm doing on a Sunday morning is like changing the world. I don't think when I record a podcast that it is. I'm not a. Did you ever sing that song? Probably did because you went to Passion conferences, right? History Maker. Do you remember that song, History Maker?
Oh, that was
Oh,
Delirious. Was it Delirious?
yeah. Delirious. I'm going to be a history maker in this land. I'm probably not. You know, the joy of one of my favorite shows, Seinfeld, in its like, self-aware postmodern deprecation is to say, didn't you ever notice how most of your life is kind of filled with these absurd, meaningless interactions? And you go, yes. The meta-modern shift is to say, instead of just going, they are meaningless, that when we have a reintegrated, re-enchanted worldview, that I can live in a story where I go, yeah, most of my interactions are, my day is made up of objectively meaningless. Like I couldn't, from a third person perspective, go, yes, this is definitively full of meaning, because I am accepting meaning only insofar as I'm accepting a story. And so I go, yeah, I've noticed most of my life is filled with absurd things that are not changing the world in any way. I will die, and probably within a couple of generations, no one will remember me. Hopefully, I live long enough to see some great grandkids. But I don't get my meaning from that. I recognize it's absurd, and so there has been some value in that critique. But then, if that is the case, then I can choose a story that assigns it dignity and meaning. And if in the end I'm wrong, this is like where people go, Paul, you're an existentialist. Yeah, like in a Kierkegaardian sense. If at the end of this I am wrong, I'd rather be wrong on the side of aspirational hope, meaning, pursuing virtue, even if I'm totally delusional about it. I rather that than live as Rick from Rick and Morty.
I had that
that for me
exact
feels
experience where paying attention to the new atheism, and then even having some people in my extended family that were just really gripped by, the Dawkins and especially like Hitchens with the Hitch slaps of reality. And I would watch debates even with like Stephen Meyer on intelligent design versus people, and they would just, I was like, so if I win this, if I'm on the side that at that time was culturally winning, what do I get?
it's a great
I get to
question.
I get to be an asshole. Like that was like, that's my reward. That's what it
Yeah.
looks like.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't think I want that. And it wasn't because I was like making just a completely anti-intellectual frame, but it was also something else was like, winning, the prize for winning doesn't seem that like that's the prize for winning. That story doesn't really appeal to me. And it's not the life that I want. I still had to
No.
figure out a lot of things and have a lot of other failures. But the interesting thing then on the other side of some of that stuff was, I had I was, when I got out of ministry and was out of ministry for a while, and I was back at community college, getting a nursing degree. And I was like, I met this kid that was watching, Peterson, but he had left Jehovah's Witnesses and he was on his own. They had, kicked him, said him, that's part of their, their culture and stuff. And he was shunned. And so we had like this 6-hour conversation one day after we kind of got to know each other a little bit. He's a really brilliant kid. And we were talking about, because basically like Dawkins, and they actually liberated him from his, from Jehovah's Witnesses. Was this something that he was looking for that was true beyond a lot of what he would call, gaslighting in that situation. So, I sat there and I came to this point and I was like, you know what I think? And I attribute this to like kind of having at that point in like 17, like absorbed some Peterson up to that point. And I was like, evolution or secular humanism has to have evolution, and it has to have, atheism has to have evolution, and it has to have secular humanism to make sense. And that goes all the way back to the first part of our conversation about coherence, purpose, and what was the other one? I can't remember, but
significance.
significance, and I made this little triangle, and he kind of stared at it for a second, like, and I didn't even know. It may have been God. Maybe I don't even know how I came to that conclusion back then. But it was like, and it was even for me was like realizing almost in that moment myself, like there's narratives that we are putting ourselves into, and they have real consequences, and they are held up by certain things, and so that was that moment for me. It's like, this is the story, but I also had things related to the stories in Scripture that helped me make a Kierkegaardian leap of faith to, become, to go deeper in my faith, to choose to trust God on a deeper level than I ever had. And so I continue to posit that it's the best one, or the truest one, or the true one, or whatever. And I want to ask you on this moment, like into the culture, you've recently, kind of were tagging like the West Huff with Joe Rogan. You have the kind of like Bible history and biblical studies, and Joe being on this journey you kind of referenced already. What are you seeing with these connections happening, like with Wes going on there, and he had Stephen Meyer, and like what is that continuing to say about what's happening in our culture?
I think Joe follows his journey insofar as that I can see it publicly, which is only a small portion of Joe Rogan's journey. So I can't make pronounctive judgments on it. But insofar as I've seen it publicly, Joe has gone on a trajectory with religion, the traditional religion, with stories of ultimate concern that address our deepest questions of life. He has gone from the kind of typical new atheist online guy, who thinks that all we need to do is remove religion and we will be ushered into some, utopian state of perfect harmony that John Lennon sings about and Imagine. And Joe has gone from that to being, pretty disparaging. You can see early comments where he makes, really oftentimes uneducated claims. Like very early on, there's clips out there of him talking about how the Bible was made by Constantine. And it's just like, those are the kind of like Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code. It's poor scholarship, first and foremost. It feeds into the kind of the new atheist idea that this is not just super rational, like the leap of faith requires more than pure reason, but that it is irrational and that is incoherent story. And Joe's trajectory has gone on this path of seeing that maybe, from my vantage point, the story of new atheism, the reductive materialist story, I don't think Joe has ever really bought into the story that all we are is matter and nothing more. There's no mind. There's nothing beyond it, which is why he's always attracted to aliens.
And psychedelics.
And psychedelics. Yeah, psychedelics are for him. He knows deep down, as many people do. Not everyone does for whatever reason, but I think Joe's very high in openness, obviously, and he has had this sense that in the absence of that story, we have to have some other vehicle for experiencing transcendence. And for him, that has looked like psychedelics, aliens. Clay Rutledge has talked about this for years. Clay Rutledge has done like legit scientific laboratory in his scientific research and great papers on how humans are fundamentally a spiritual species. And what we actually see in the rise of nuns, Nones, is that people do not turn away typically from a transcendent desire for something that goes beyond the story of reductive physicalism. They don't do that. They turn to DIY spiritualities. They turn to psychedelics. They turn to aliens and NHI encounters. And so what I've started to notice with Joe, especially since he moved to Texas, which is not a coincidence, like we are products of the culture that we live in. So he moved from California to Texas. You find yourself surrounded by a lot more people, as he mentioned to Wesley Huff and I think Mel Gibson recently, is like Christians, it seems like their philosophy works. They're more loving. Like the ones that are really committed that I've been around in my life, they're more loving. The ones that really follow Jesus, I'm paraphrasing here, they're just like better people to be around. And so the testimony of that is leading him, I think, to exploring the possibility of a better source of transcendent wonder and transcendent fulfillment. And so I think he is seeing what he is a kind of, you could call him an archetype. You could say he is emblematic of a broader shift that comes with the death of new atheism and into what I've maybe just called, I don't know if anybody else has used this term, a religious renaissance. Just as the haunting of our secular frame, to use the language of Charles Taylor, we are haunted perpetually by transcendence. It's the story of Interstellar. Interstellar is the perfect parable of our secular age, where Matthew McConaughey's character, Murph, she has this book fall in her room, and she's like, it's a ghost. Matthew McConaughey, secular frame, good materialist, good scientist, goes, well, study it with science. There's a scientific explanation. And the scientific explanation he doesn't seem to have it fit within that frame. They're haunted by transcendence. So he goes and hunts for what the source of transcendence might be, this transcendent source. In the end, I find Nolan's answer to not be fulfilling, but it is a clear signal of a quest for transcendence that is emblematic of this shift where we've been haunted too much. Joe's haunted by the phenomena that he has experienced on psychedelic trips. Many people do have that experience. He's described them as largely positive. There are plenty of people who have had both positive and have had encounters with things. And I've got plenty of episodes in the back catalog with former psychonauts who have had this journey of their own, where they encountered transcendence, but they found something that the ancients knew. They found that not every power that transcends us is automatically for our good. There might be a range of powers there. And I think Joe is somebody that is very open to that. And I've noticed just this shift where he's like moving from religion as a tool of oppression, the postmodern new atheist critique, to like, oh man, in the absence of that, we've seen all of these things that have rushed to fill the vacuum that feel far worse. Joe's been really concerned about wokeism. I hate using that term, but everybody knows what it means. That something else has filled the void. Dawkins has lamented for these last few years. We're not doing science anymore because it's been taken over by wokeism. Well, guess what, bud? You killed Superman. And what rushed to fill the vacuum was Darkseid. That always happens. Something worse always fills the vacuum. This is what happens. And so we are now realizing we kind of want Superman back. Like, we want that. What has filled the vacuum and the void from our limited exposure to it over the last few years have been, Joe Rogan's talking about this all the time. I heard a Vice President, J.D. Vance, talk about, these things as substitute religions. That was nowhere in anybody's collective grammar until a few years ago, when people started realizing these connections. So the question then becomes, if I want a transcendent story, what's the story that can best support coherence, purpose, and significance? And I think Joe is very intrigued by the person of Jesus. The two things I notice he is stuck on, I don't want to say stuck on. I don't want to use that term. I'm not trying to convert Joe. I have a story that I believe in, that I'm giving my life to. I invite others into it. I'm not trying to talk anybody into it, or I wouldn't try to talk Joe Rogan into it. There's no point. What I see him getting caught on in the Christian story is the resurrection, so that's come up multiple times for him. And it's also come up for him what you've mentioned early on. He wrestles. You notice his instant follow-up question. I don't watch him every week, but I did watch the Wes Huff interview, and I watched the Mel Gibson one because it was interesting. They went back to back pretty much. Instantly after resurrection questions, you notice what he asked them, like either right after or at some point in that conversation. Well, what do you make of evolution? What do you make of science? And both of them had answers that I don't find satisfactory. But that for him is like, okay, here's my sticking point. Like, I really actually find that people who are following this Jesus, I actually like being around them more. And if they had their way in the world, it seems like it would be a better world. But I also have to acknowledge this has to be a coherent story. So I can't believe in somebody who these people are claiming to be the risen Son of God if the resurrection didn't happen. That would be incoherent. I can't believe in someone who would be the risen Son of God and step into that story if I have to step into that story and then like kind of deny that Göbekli Tepe, which he always talks about. Like there were people there before 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. It's obvious. It just was. And I don't mean to stir up any controversy with my friends who are young earth creationists. I understand why they come there. But Joe is looking for a coherent story, and that's a sticking point for him as well. I think it's emblematic of larger shifts as people are returning to saying, I want Superman back. I'm using symbolic language here. I want Superman. This is way worse what we've had. I'll take this. I'll take what we had before with all the faults, all the shortcomings. I'll take that because it gives me meaning. It gives me a story. It gives forgiveness. It gives hope. It gives all these other things. I think Joe sees that. And I wouldn't be surprised if in some way, shape, or form, this isn't going to be like the way any team wants it. But I do think I would not be surprised if in the next year, Joe says something akin to, yeah, I believe in Jesus.
Yeah, I'm kind of a Christian. Yeah, you know, like kind of. Yeah,
I think even more than that, though. I would not be surprised if it ends up being more than that. What I'm saying is, it might not be satisfactory to any team. Is like, you know,
where he lands. Like if he lands,
yeah, the Baptists would be like, well, then you got to stop cussing and you got to stop drinking. You know, and then the Ortho Bros will tell them, you know, you got to go to divine liturgy because this is the one true church. And then the Catholics will be like, you know, they'll all have their qualms with him. I don't see him going like, I'm going to mass every week and then, or I'm going to do my once a month.
That kind of gets me thinking about, have you seen Paul throw out the metavangelical thing? Like, I mean,
yeah, I have seen a little bit.
So, I mean, how does that hit you? How does that in relationship even to that with Joe? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't watched enough of Paul's videos on that. I've seen him more talking about it on Twitter X. My feedback to him is that this is what he's describing is something the theologian Robert Weber talked about for years in his books on what we would call ancient future worship. What he called ancient future worship was this movement towards like a recovery of the best of our past with an eye towards the future. How do we integrate? It is what H.R. Niebuhr talked about in Christ and Culture, is the perpetual quest of Christianity, which is to always recontextualize what it means to follow Jesus in the gospel to an ever-changing culture. I see it as a continuation of that. And part of that project is kind of I think less, in some ways, a lot of people are less territorial about their, like, here's my identification markers. And as we become more integrated online, at least exposed to different ideas online, I think it becomes more difficult to be like, well, here's this, although I see it all the time, especially between Protestants and Catholics, good faith discussion and real Christ-like charity would make it more difficult for somebody to believe really like bad faith arguments about some other tribe, because if you're interacting with them all the time, you know, if somebody wants to tell me like, I consider Sam Tiedemann a friend, we disagree on the ontology, the metaphysics of God in some significant ways. If somebody was like, well, that means Sam doesn't love Jesus, I would tell them, oh, no, I can't say that. Now, Sam is just, if I put Sam in a bunch of labels and I go, he's Unitarian, he's this, I can critique a label, you know, more easily than, or I can not just critique, I can demonize a label more easily than I can demonize a person that I have actually grown to trust and appreciate.
That's a great line.
So I think the more as
I can demonize a
Yeah.
label easier than I can demonize a person.
Yeah, so I think in the case of the interactions that might be happening, like in this little corner, we've got people that come from all sorts of different traditions, and you hash stuff out sometimes, you have arguments, but what ends up happening is maybe something that is whatever Paul wants to call it. It doesn't look. It looks like a synthesis. It looks like an effort towards synthesizing multiple perspectives. Now, which like culture becomes the most like dominant self-identification? So maybe that's why he's keeping the like jellical from evangelical in it, because it does seem like in many ways the evangelical values of being like, hey, um, we're gonna proselytize in some way. We're gonna get and start a podcast or a YouTube channel where we try to tell people about what we perceive to be the gospel. The maybe inherent Protestant suspicion of things. Like, I don't know how many times I've even heard recently, committed Catholics who have like incredibly strong critiques of Pope Francis. And, it's like, well, how much of that is because you're kind of still in a Protestant culture and you're around evangelicals, so you become more open? I don't know. But I think it's fascinating. I do highly recommend like Robert Weber. Maybe it's Weber. I always forget how to pronounce his last name, but just like Google search Robert Weber, Ancient Future Worship. And he was talking about how in evangelical settings, Protestant settings, there's been, kind of a recovery of tradition, and that the future of worship will look like, how do we hold to the story that we've received the best we can? How do we have rituals that reenact that story well, so that we are living in God's story? He was very ahead of the curve on a lot of these things.
I think the you kind of pointed out like, well, what will be the, I don't know if you use the word dominant or like the prominent thing at the end of whatever, if there's an end, but
Yeah.
like the way I see it right now is just that, evangelicalism was something seen as like a political movement almost, but there was a subculture that was like, that you and I were birthed out of, that it was like
Yeah.
sincere and and I don't, and then it reached like critical mass in like the tens with the mega church movements and the modern worship thing. And within that institution, in a loose form of institution, there were actual innovations that took place that are now being implemented by the historical traditions. And that's where I
Yeah.
see the
Yeah.
meta
Great point.
part coming back in, because if you go to last year's adoration of the Eucharist conference that was like up, Minnesota or Wisconsin. I
Yeah.
don't know if you saw any clips, but it was like
No, I
nuns on
did.
their knees with their hands
Totally.
up.
I
They
had
had carrying
on.
robe
Yeah, I had turned on
song.
the TV and I saw that on there, and I saw John Mark McMillan, who wrote the song "How He Loves," is a very, very dear
Mhm,
friend of mine. I turned it on,
mhm.
and they're singing his song, like how, or whether it was "How He Loves" or "King of My Heart," might have been "King of My Heart."
Yeah,
He's written both of those, and I recorded a video of it. I'm like, dude, Catholics are killing this right now. They're belting this thing out, and yeah,
yeah.
that
That to
synthesis.
me that to me is the bigger signpost of something beyond, because it's like, and even I went to my nephew's or my niece's christening. My wife's family is very Catholic, and like I pick up the bulletin and there's a Phil Wickham song in the liturgy, and I'm like, and of course the trads are just like but that, I think that when you look at that, there were like, neon green or yellow lights on the Eucharist, and there was the worship band on the side, but then you also had the icons and the jeweled crosses and the processions, and it just was like, what am I seeing here? And it's not, and I think even to the point of, because the Orthodox are, they're going to lay claim to, no, we're going to hold to the traditions, but like they're excellent when I look at all the guys that are prominent on YouTube, they all come out of Protestantism for the most part, whether that's Peugeot, Damick, Father
Mhm.
Stephen DeYoung, even the guy on Nectar out of like New LA, like he was like reformed before. And it's like in reformed and evangelicalism and the waters that was all bird, like they're engaging with a medium that, you know, the first time I ever saw a church service online was produced by a mega church in around 2007, 2008, out of like really high level production rock music being translated well, like at studio production level. It was like you had to have, you know, millions of dollars set
Totally,
up to be able to produce that
totally.
in 2007, 2008. You know, that was live streaming. I think Piper was one of the first people to just put sermons on podcasts like crazy,
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
and 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 uh and so you kind of like ProPresenter was made by evangelical uh
Yep.
thing, and it got used at the Super Bowl. And anybody that's doing a conference at that level, like the Catholic Church was using that. And I see all those things just being like, well, you have to, oh no, we're the one true, but like we like it. We were in a weird time. That's the meta that I kind of see is like, you know, there's the doctrine and the doctrine versus the confession versus then like the communion of something
Yeah.
happening in the hallway, then
Mhm.
coming back into our spaces, in the hallway, coming back to our spaces. Like, um, that's kind of my frame on that. And identifying, I saw somebody today, this really got me thinking that, you know, Protestantism is a negative vision. Like you are identified by what you're against. But evangelicalism actually was a positive vision about the good news, which so I and that is actually where the positive vision like has birthed the innovation and it's feeding now into these places and they're all, I don't know. That's kind of what's been going through my mind
Yeah.
on that.
Couple quick thoughts, in response to that. I mean, I do think I wanna say something first of all, like, you know, I wanna catch myself, you know, I said the term "ortho bros" earlier, and I don't I apologize for those that's a term. I'm using it as a term of endearment. I'm not trying to use
Sure.
it in a way that's derogatory, but I understand there's pejorative connotations to it. So those of you that are in Orthodox communities, I'm apologize for that. Um, I do want to say though, in the same breath, that I think there's kind of like the recency bias, and we're fascinated by novelty. I'm not like a here's the synods of Dort. I'm not like here's my flag in Protestantism. I think it's very tempting to these critiques of Protestant ethos to say, well, it's all Protestants' fault for replacing, the sacrament of the Eucharist with a sermon, and now we're stuck in the propositional. There's I think there's a lot of value to relooking at that. The idea that it's inherently an antithesis movement. I don't think that's necessarily historically accurate or fair to those that would be like, oh man, I'm really, like a Paul Vanderklay who's saying Paul doesn't have like hard stakes in the ground here, but Paul's very open about being a Calvinist and being in Dutch Reform camp and very influenced by the Protestant thing. The um, one quick observation is that J.W. McClendon in his like third systematic theology, which is called Witness, he talked about how and he's very much touched by postmodern thought and influence, but he brought up this idea, John 17, Jesus's high priestly prayer is that we would all, the disciples of Jesus would all be one, even as he and the Father are one. And I think his critique was that for much of history, the Christians have had arguments, kind of this like one ring to rule them all approach about what unity looks like is going to be when my team wins. And I do think positively, maybe some of the postmodern critique of, hey, you're situated in a story and you probably have some blind spots, have opened us up in some positive ways to moving away from the one ring to rule them all approach. I realize there's certainly people in those camps that are like, the Protestants have, the King James only have to win, the Orthodox have to win, or something like that. But I think this kind of like messy synthesis, this hodgepodge that maybe Vanderklay has been kind of like interested in, is signaling something that McClendon talked about, which is maybe we get to a pivot point where we recognize that unity does not mean unity is not without harmony. There's a difference between something, you get this as a musician, there's a difference between everybody playing a C major, just holding down a C note, and then when you add like the fifth and the third, and then maybe sometimes you add the seventh. And in music, you get that truth, the perception of beauty is not limited to hearing one singular note. And so I have taken from McClendon's observation that these different traditions may just have a particular, what he calls convictional location, that we see some part of the picture. And by seeing some part, if we can, in charity, open ourselves up to go, I know I see in part from this particular vantage point. Can you tell me what you see? That we might move beyond a cynical postmodernism to a sort of hopeful, I recognize my limitations. I recognize I'm situated in a culture. I recognize, because I'm a Midwestern white dude with a beard, that I might have certain propensities and ways of seeing the world. And that I notice when we have these kinds of conversations, it's largely the range of different kinds of people, not different traditions, but come from really diverse, different cultures. I mean, you'll just take note. There's not a lot of African-American voices present in public conversation in this little corner of the internet. That's not a slight to it, but that would be to say, there might be important part of seeing more of the whole is like, yeah, I will pick up a James Cone book and just read it. I'm going to pick that up. I'm going to pick up a Latin American liberation theologian and read it, not from the perspective of going like, I have to win an argument, or maybe I'm wrong about everything, but to go, I see from a convictional location. So there's some benefit that my dear, and I'm using this in the positive term to try to make up for the fact that might have been pejorative, my dear ortho bros have contributed so much to my life. The Orthodox tradition helped me in so many ways, helped me synthesize parts of my charismatic upbringing that I'd never heard the term theosis before. And then when I got exposed to that idea, which came from the East, I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. That's everything we were looking for in the charismatic stream. Why didn't anybody set it up in those terms? It was positive. So I say, I have something maybe to offer and see from here. It's like we all are standing on different mountaintops looking down on a valley, and parts of our view may be obscured. And we have to recognize there's no seeing from nowhere, right? There's no, I'm just objectively third person seeing it all. That's not a denial that there could be a God's eye view, objective, third person, an objective God perspective, but it's a recognition. I have limitations. I might not see it all. I might even have some hurts that make me go, man, I can't see it from there because like I broke my leg and I can't even climb all the way up to the top of the mountain. So I'm gonna have to see from here. But maybe that brother or sister or someone else from that different tradition can see some part that maybe I have missed. And so a positive, maybe more the meta part, is an aspirational, a hopeful looking at that and going, these divisions could actually be like a beautiful symphony where we're not just tuning to A440. When we tune to A440, everybody's hitting the same note, right? It's boring. It's bland. You don't go, oh, that's beautiful when the orchestra's tuning. What sounds beautiful are notes in harmony and even sometimes dissonance, like intentional dissonance, like you might hear in jazz music. It's intentional, and that dissonance eventually gets resolved. You can come at this from a very negative, skeptical, cynical, postmodern perspective. You can come to it from a sort of, I need to win, and I'm going to have like the old modernist debates, and we're going to line up the William Lane Craigs with the Sam Harrises, and we're going to see whose worldview wins. It's a collision of worldviews.
Blood sport.
Yeah, I'll tap into my kayfabe voice here. We could have that sort of stuff. I think this little corner, from what I've perceived, has long been bored by those kinds of debates, and are maybe figuring out Is this like a one ring to rule them all situation? Is this like a perennialist situation where we say all paths lead to the same truth? No. Is it a meta modern synthesis that might go, I'm seeing here? What are you seeing, Christian? Sam, what are you seeing? I totally disagree with you, Sam, on this point, but that doesn't discount the fact that you may see things here. Paul Vanderklay, you grew up in the Dutch Reformed tradition, Calvinist. I grew up in hyper free will Arminian. Well, we never called ourselves Arminian. Hyper free will, charismatic, Pentecostal. I see this instead of us coming together and being like, I have never once had an argument with Paul about Calvinism, even though I'm not a Calvinist. It's just like, hey, great. I get that's your convictional location. I so value everything else you add to it. I think in a positive way, we could be really cynical and be like, yeah, there's some battle here to see which tradition is going to rule them all. And is it really the evangelicals because the Catholics are using ProPresenter now? We could be suspicious about it. Or the Catholics could go, man, the evangelicals have really killed it in using ProPresenter and Planning Center. That's a great idea. And now we are running this race with humility and charity in a way that maybe it's just more in keeping with what Jesus envisioned in John 17 in that prayer. I don't know. You can be optimistic, you can be cynical. I've done 3+ decades of cynicism, and I guess I'm just tired of it.
I like it. I hope that mine didn't come across as cynicism, but
it
was like,
definitely not.
Okay.
Definitely not.
Yeah, it was like, no, I think this is good. Can we kind of celebrate this together? It was kind of, and I love that line you said earlier. I can demonize a label more easier than I can demonize a person. I also think that's a little bit in the ethos as well of kind of this corner space. And so as we're kind of like closing down here, I wanted to ask you, like as I kind of started paying attention to you last year, and I think, did you take a sabbatical last year? Was that part of?
Yeah.
So, I guess previously you'd written a book. And so right as I was kind of like starting to pay attention to more people in this space, you kind of like dipped into a little bit of some time off. But I noticed towards the end of the year, it just seemed like you were really starting to fire on some stuff. Like, I don't know if there's something to that, but I was curious about that. And then also to kind of say, what are you looking forward to this year? And as we kind of round out our conversation today.
Yeah. I mean, sabbatical for me was just a gift in my day job of being a pastor, which I'm always like, when I do my public facing work, I make it clear, like, I'm in a congregational church context where the people in my community have selected me, like chosen me to lead them. So I lead in that regard. I never come out and be like, I'm pastor so-and-so in my public facing work. I'm not speaking on behalf of them or for them. It's a title that we use in our church to delineate a particular role of service to our local community. So when they every 6 years, they in our church context, going into our 7th year, we get a sabbatical. So that 3-month time was very helpful. I detached from the sorts of things that I know gave me a sense of identity, which I do find a lot of identity in the work that I do, and that's positive. But actually having seasons where we kind of like fast from that and step away from that and realize that our life isn't bound up in doing or in the personas we might present to people is a good checks and balances system to make sure, is this driven by proper motivation? Is there anything here that might be presenting itself as pursuing a good, but it's actually trying to, trying to heal some part of me that I'm using this as some sort of drug. So that was a really tremendously helpful and beneficial time. So coming out of that, I was really navigating. I don't know how I'm going to interact with social media. I don't like the amount of time I have spent on screens the last 10 years. I don't think it's good. I don't think it shapes me in a way. I don't think social media largely shapes me in a way. The more time I spend on it, the more I find that it's producing in me something that doesn't, it's not leading to my wholeness. But that being said, I've also recognized that this facet of my public facing work, I have, going back to the very beginning of the conversation, I made this intentionally a kind of a form of a classroom. I've moved away from that classroom, my analogy, and have tried to become intentionally, and I'm intending over this next year to do more compression of ideas down from just the academic lingo, which I was always trying to function as a bridge between academia and where people that are interested in the subject matter but aren't necessarily going to school might bridge. I'm trying to bridge maybe a little bit more intentionally. Today's conversation might not be a great we've got pretty deep here. So I might not have done a good job with that. But yeah, so kind of like been more active on Twitter in large part, just to be honest, because suddenly people did care. I've been talking
Mm,
about these things for about 6-7 years, and part of it is like I'm not going to give my time and attention to things that aren't connecting or helping people in any way, you know?
mm,
And then suddenly, especially coming out of the election, I noticed that there's been a cultural shift. Again, we've had a couple of elections in recent history where like polling data does not seem to be an accurate presentation of where people's values are at in culture. And so people are turning to other avenues or methods of explanation and exploration. And I don't know, suddenly in the last few months, I think I've found, others have found this as well, that people are like, so for the first time in my life, I find myself like on a cable news show talking about Top Gun. I've talked about theology, religious ideas embedded in movies for 7 years. I think this past election, people were like, well, wait a second. How did the polls and the talking heads and CNN and Fox News miss cultural shifts? This isn't a stamp of approval on a political team, but it's just an acknowledgement. There's been some big shifts,
yeah.
that have happened, and a lot of people have missed it. And so they're open to it, open to different methods of exploration. And so I'm trying to help people make sense of their life. And so in this next year, I think I'm kind of narrowing in on my public facing work of focusing on things that I could feel like I could speak to a range of people that don't necessarily share like our Christian subculture upbringing, trying to be more intentional. I can apply let's exegete a particular biblical text or talk about some issue of systematic theology in the face-to-face encounters I have with people in my day job in our local church community. And then this public facing work, I'm just really realizing I want to just focus in more on helping people make sense of the way culture and the guiding stories that we consume in culture, in particular popular culture, are shaping our lives. Like we live in a story. And so that's something I'm focusing more on over the next year. We'll see what happens. I'm working towards, this isn't an official announcement. My intentions are working towards another book. I'm working with a literary agent and be meeting with some publishers, hopefully in the near future, to talk about meaning, culture, these shifts in culture in a way that might be beneficial to other people. So those are some things on the kind of like public facing side of my work that I'm doing and looking forward to here in 2025.
Well, I have enjoyed the punchier stuff that I've connected with. Like, we didn't really go down into the Superman comic and or the kayfabe conversation, but because I also enjoyed that one you did with the WWE on Netflix and stuff. So
Oh,
I want to
thank
point
you.
people
Yeah.
to that, and to that's kind of what you're talking about, is kind of being more punchy and broad. But also on your X, you've got your link tree. You can get to your book, and I'll put a description of that or put that in the description as well. But man, thanks for having this conversation with me today, meeting me and connecting, and in this space, in this kind of corner of the internet space. And hopefully, yeah, I'm going to be interested to see this year. Like, I look forward to when the James Gunn Superman comes out. I'm going to be really interested in kind of hearing, because I think it seems like you might have a thought or two on that once it comes out.
Yeah, let's reconnect when it gets close to that, or even maybe right after it comes out, and we can do some debrief on it. Yeah, I think it will be emblematic of a cultural shift towards this thing we call post-ironic sincerity or new sincerity. I got plenty of videos out there that are talking about that if you want to get a little snapshot of it. Yeah, thanks, Christian. This has been a blast. You're really good at this, and I just want to encourage you. It's really hard to gauge, like, yeah, is this like what I'm doing like an effective use of my time? And you know, I would just say to you, anybody else that's listening that makes stuff like this, and you're having really, really great conversations, just to encourage you, like, don't make your primary metric views, subs, clicks. It's just, there has to be some other metric for fruitfulness. And I think a better metric, I just would encourage you in, Christian, because I love what you're doing, man. And however the Spirit leads you to give your time and attention, I'm not trying to steer you in a direction, but just to encourage you that, like, our number one goal, I think, is faithfulness, and faithfulness is in our control. The fruit that comes from it is not. So that which is outside of our control, we entrust. And I have some videos that have had hundreds of thousands of views, others where I feel like, man, this was the best podcast guest I've ever had. And it's like, got 10 views, but coming out of that, I might get like a message from somebody that has like this deep moment of transformative insight. And it's like the weighing of this stuff. I don't know, so use your time as the Spirit leads you, but I just want to encourage you. I think from what I've seen, these are really encouraging conversations that you're having. They're great. You've asked awesome questions. I'm just honored to be a part of it. And I think, just keep being faithful and entrust the fruitfulness to being outside of your control and whatever it looks like. And that's all we can do.
Awesome. I will take that to heart. I appreciate it. And hang around. We'll finish this backstage real quick. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.